They're coming. They're almost here. The cicadas are emerging after spending over a decade underground. But this spring isn't just any ordinary cicada season. For the first time since 1803, two different broods of cicadas will appear together across the Midwest and Southeast. A dual emergence that won't happen again for 221 years. In mere weeks, the Great Southern Brood on a 13-year cycle and the Northern Illinois Brood on a 17-year cycle are set to synchronize in a once-in-a-lifetime event.
That the last time that they have been out together was the same year as the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson was in the White House.
Millions upon millions of these insects will tunnel out from the earth and begin their ear-splitting mating ritual.
In really dense areas, they will reach decibel levels that are comparable to a jet engine taking off.
This rare event could result in more than 1 trillion cicadas over 16 states. But where will this rare dual emergence occur? And what does it mean for us humans? Today we are going off the radar to find out what we can do to prepare for the cicadas and the surprising beneficial impact they could have on our yards and our minds. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie, and you're listening to Off the Radar, a production of the National Weather Desk. On the show, we dig deep into topics about weather, climate, the ocean, space, and much more. Our goal is to help you better understand the weather and to love it as much as we do. Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening to this episode of Off the Radar. Today is all about cicadas and the emergence of two different broods at the same time. And there's going to be some overlap, both in time and space. So to get all the info on this upcoming event, today I'm talking to entomologist Dr. Floyd Shockley. He oversees all insect collection at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. Now, if you lived in the mid-Atlantic in the D.C. area about 3 years ago, you no doubt remember the emergence of brood 10 cicadas. It was pretty intense. The sound was deafening at times, and the fog of cicadas was so thick it was being picked up on weather radar. Some people hid from them, some people ate them, but they were short-lived, literally. While a swarm of red-eyed insects may sound terrifying, you'll find out from Dr. Shockley today that not only are they harmless, they can also be beneficial. Dr. Shockley, well, so nice to meet you, and thanks for joining us. Let's talk about cicadas because this very rare event is about to happen right around the corner this spring. So can you start by telling me, for those who aren't familiar with kind of how cicadas are classified, the different types of cicadas? Can you explain that to me?
Well, sure. So cicadas are one of a number of piercing sucking insects. They're related in distantly to things like aphids, tree hoppers, leaf hoppers. So these guys, as adults, feed exclusively on plant juices, and so they feed on trees. They feed on small plants. They're not usually into feeding on grasses, although there are a few grass cicadas. And there's thousands of species, although there's only about a little less than 200 here in the U.S. And the ones that most people are talking about this year are the periodical cicadas, which there's only 7 species of those. All of the rest are what are known as annual cicadas. And those are the ones, even though they're called annual cicadas, they're not actually like they don't lay eggs and then emerge in a year. They're actually in the ground for a couple of years. But there are some of those out every year. And those are the ones that the people are much more familiar with. And they don't do the mass emergence thing that the periodical cicadas do.
How far underground are they?
So most cicadas are not that deep. You'd be surprised. They're usually between 12 and 24 inches, depending on whether or not this is an emergence year. Sometimes they'll be a little bit closer to the surface. Sometimes they're a little bit deeper. But usually it's in that range of 1 to 2 feet underground. That's for both the annual cicadas as well as the periodical cicadas.
Okay, so what is happening this spring?
Well, that's a really complicated question. The thing that's getting a lot of people's attention right now is we actually have a relatively rare event of two broods emerging at the same time, which actually that isn't so rare. It actually happens about once a decade. But what makes this one unique is that they are adjacent broods, which means that they are right next to each other. And all 7 species will be out at the same time. That is rare. Usually you get some 17 years or you get some 13 years, but you don't usually get 17 and 13 year cicadas out at the same time in an area where there's a very little, but an actual overlap in their distribution. So there's going to be a lot of cicadas, for one, because there are 2 broods. In some cases, it could be upwards of 1 to 1.5 million cicadas per acre in areas where there's a really large population. So over the course of basically starting in mid-April through about the end of May, that 6-week period, there will be trillions of cicadas out and trying to find mates and trying to create the next generation that will either be 17 or 13 year cycle cicadas.
When's the last time this has happened?
Brood 13, which is a 17-year cicada brood, and brood 19, which is a 13-year brood, only synchronizes every 221 years. So that means that the last time that they have been out together was the same year as the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson was in the White House. So that'll provide some perspective about how rare these two, and it kind of makes sense, right? Because they're on slightly different cycles, and so it basically takes 221 years for the 17 and the 13 to catch up with one another and be out in the same year.
Okay, so this is really cool what you do, because it's almost like astronomy, where you're like, you can predict these things so far in advance. But this event is once in a lifetime. Like, this is not going to happen again for another couple hundred years. Can you tell me where they're going to happen and where the crossover zone is?
Sure. So it's not going to be hard to find brood 19. That's known as the Great Southern Brood. That's the 13-year cicada brood because it's massive. It actually starts over here in Virginia, extends down across the southeastern U.S., extends all the way to the west. It doesn't quite get into Texas, and then it starts to curve up northward into Missouri, Illinois. So it covers a massive swath of the eastern U.S. And then the brood 13, which is known as the Northern Illinois brood, is not ironically in Northern Illinois, is where the bulk of them are going to be. Although that brood does extend into eastern Iowa, southern Wisconsin, and a little bit into western Indiana. And so the area of overlap is in Illinois. They come very close to one another. As a matter of fact, brood 13 and brood 19 will likely both be out in different parts of Springfield, Illinois. They might interbreed.
I was going to say, are these two going to hook up and create some sort of super breed?
So typically not. What we have examined in the past when we've had this sort of thing where we could study it, what usually happens when you have 13 years and 17 years in close enough proximity to interbreed. And that's one thing I want to sort of focus on for just a second. So the species within a particular brood don't naturally interbreed. So 17-year broods usually have 3 species, and 13-year broods usually have 4 species. They cannot interbreed with one another within a brood, but when you do get adjacent broods, there is the possibility of interbreeding between the two. And that's because the species between the two broods are actually more closely related to each other than they are the species within their own brood. Now, we don't think that that's going to lead much. There certainly would be hybrids generated by that, but it's not like there's suddenly going to be 15-year cicadas if you have a 17 or a 13 breed. What you typically end up having is some of the hybrids will emerge as 13-year cicadas, and some will emerge as 17-year cicadas. And whichever one happens to be large enough to persist with whatever their parent brood is, they'll resynchronize with their parent brood after that first cycle. So we typically don't find too many things in the middle. Now, that's not to say that you can't have cicadas off cycle. It actually happens every year. Some of these cicadas underground don't count correctly. They get the year wrong. It's usually either 1 year or 4 years too early, or 1 year or 4 years too late. There's a term for it called they're stragglers. And if you have enough straggler cicadas that are out in the wrong year and they create enough of an emergence for breeding and predators don't eat them all, then you get what's known as a spurious brood. And a spurious brood, if it persists for more than one cycle, can actually become a new brood.
Wow. Okay, so there's a lot that goes into kind of figuring these out. Can you tell me from like the human's perspective what this means for us? What can we expect? Is this going to be disrupting our daily lives at all?
It's certainly possible. So especially in areas of dense emergence, we're going to see, as I said, millions of cicadas per acre. So while the cicadas themselves are not particularly harmful, they're not really going to cause damage to the trees because the trees have evolved with the cicadas. They don't attack like plants in your garden. Pets tend to consume them, and many pets don't have an off button. And so while they're not toxic, they can make a dog sick if he eats too many of them. But otherwise, they're not gonna cause any direct harm to people or their pets or households. But they are certainly going to be annoying. So the male will be singing at peak about 2 weeks after the emergence begins. So usually that's in the first couple of weeks of May. In really dense areas, they will reach decibel levels that are comparable to a jet engine taking off. So
wow.
It's quite loud. It's unpleasant if you're in a really dense area of these guys. If you have outdoor plans, they certainly can be disrupted because you'll see males calling really loudly and females flying to try and find the males that are singing the best. And so in areas of really high concentration, I could certainly see sporting events, weddings, anniversaries and reunions being disrupted if they happen to be in areas of really high concentrations during that period. But again, it's more of an annoyance. It's not that they're actually inherently dangerous or anything.
What about weather? Does this impact the whole process at all? Has there been any research about weather patterns or their mating situation when it comes to weather?
So there's actually been quite a lot of research done of the impacts of both weather and longer-term climatological changes. We certainly know that climate change is impacting the distribution of these guys. Some of the southern broods are moving a little bit further north each cycle. We also see emergences happening earlier. As I said, usually they're very predictable. They start in late April and go into May, but that's starting to creep forward as the planet warms. Because the cicadas are using a series of things. First off, they're using cues from their host trees, which of course trees are seasonal, right? Most of the hardwoods in the eastern U.S. have a seasonality to them, and they're using the tree's natural cycle to count. But also they use local temperatures. So when the soil temperature where they are reaches 64 degrees in the year of an emergence, that's their cue to come to the surface. And so On a warming planet, we're reaching 64 degrees a foot to 2 feet down earlier every year. And so it's not inconceivable that we could soon see cicadas starting to emerge in early April, maybe even late March in some parts of the distribution. And that's all because of the climatological effects, making them basically miss the normal time and come out a little sooner. And when they emerge as nymphs, they're emerging in order to molt into the adult. And local weather can impact. So first off, they like it when it's right after a rain. That's because the soil is soft. It's easier to dig. But if you happen to have low pressure or a sudden humidity drop on the day of emergence, it actually increases mortality. So the nymphs can't quite emerge as an adult, and they'll die before they actually get all the way out of their shell and harden into the adult. So you get increased mortality if you have local weather changes at just the wrong time on the night of peak emergence. There's a lot of insects and a lot of animals in general that can detect those humidity changes and those pressure drops and react accordingly. They're evolutionarily programmed to know what that means, so they'll delay part of their life cycle accordingly. So
for anybody who was kind of experienced the cicada event, maybe was it 2 years ago in like the Washington, D.C., Maryland area, 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah, Brood 10 was out here in 2021, and it was spectacular.
How would this compare?
So good question. So this brood is probably a little bit larger in terms of overall number of cicadas than the Illinois brood. It's not got quite the same number as the Great Southern brood, the 13-year brood, but that's mainly because of how big an area that covers. The abundance will be very similar. But here, because we've modified a lot of the area in Washington, D.C., there were certain areas where it was unbelievably dense with cicadas. Driving around the Beltway on 495, you were hitting hundreds of them. It was like driving through a hailstorm. So it will be very comparable to that, but across a much broader area.
People are inevitably going to try to keep these off their property with different various things. What are the do's and don'ts when it comes to dealing with cicadas?
Well, first off, we always discourage the use of pesticides, which seems to be everybody's go-to. They're scared of these guys, but we actively discourage not using pesticides for 3 reasons. First, the sheer density of cicadas. You could carpet bomb your entire backyard with pesticides, and the next day you would have an entirely new set of cicadas. So it's not very effective because even if you kill all of them, there's another million ready to move in the very next day. So it's not terribly cost effective. But more importantly, the cicadas may be consumed after they've been treated with pesticide by birds, by small mammals, and that can make them very sick. And then you also run the risk, if you use pesticides, of accidentally killing a bunch of things that you don't want to kill. So think about butterflies and bees and pollinators. They are usually impacted by the same pesticides that people would be buying at Walmart or Lowe's or wherever they get their pesticides. It's going to be over-the-counter stuff, so it's going to be broad spectrum. And sure, you're going to end up killing a whole bunch of things that you don't want to, just to kill something that isn't going to harm you or your house or your plants or your yard. And so we really actively discourage the use of pesticides. This is a relatively fast event. It will be intense in some areas, but it's very short-lived. They're usually 6 to 8 weeks, and then they're all gone, and you won't see them again probably while you're living in that particular house. It'll be the next people that live in that house will be experiencing them. So we do suggest, though, if you have young ornamentals, because the females tend to prefer their prefer to lay their eggs in smaller stems, not really large branches. If you have a concern about that, you can buy landscaping mesh of small enough diameter holes at, again, any place where you can get landscaping supplies. And you can wrap those. As long as the female can't reach the surface of the tree with her ovipositor, then you're not going to get any damage. The other thing I will say is I think people are going to probably notice about a week to 3 weeks after the cicadas are all gone, they're going to see little bunches of leaves that are browning on more mature trees. That's very normal. It's actually known as flagging. It's a reaction to basically the tree rejecting the tip of the stem that a cicada has oviposited on. And it actually has been shown scientifically that flagging actually promotes growth of the tree the subsequent year. So it's a natural pruning event that's good for most of the hardwoods that we have across the eastern U.S. So it'll be rather unusual when people start to notice it, and in some cases there will be a lot. But these trees evolved with the cicadas, so they're totally capable of surviving that. So there's no reason to go crazy. There's no reason to go snipping off the tips of those things. The very first major thunderstorm that comes through will bring those branches to the ground, and that's how many of the nymphs actually get to the ground. Is the pruning event is accelerated by thunderstorms that snap those little tips off, and they ride the little cluster of leaves and stem to the ground. And the cicadas themselves are also really beneficial to the ecosystem itself, because their tunnels coming to the surface open up pathways for water to get to penetrate deeper than it could naturally. It allows air to reach the roots of trees, which is also good for them. There's a lot of nutrient exchange that happens. And then once the cicadas mate, all of the adults are going to die. So it's going to be a very quick, rapid thing. And because they don't really disperse very far, many of them will end up decomposing and returning nutrients to the very trees that they fed on as nymphs, and that will be providing food for their nymphs later in the summer. So
the circle of life.
Absolutely.
So we should sit back, enjoy the show, and let nature take its course, is what you're saying.
That's exactly what I'm saying. It's going to be a fun experience. Having lived through several of these myself, if it bothers you, go inside. Otherwise, use this as an opportunity to talk about nature, to talk to your kids about insects, and just enjoy this natural phenomenon, because nobody alive today will see this particular event again.
Off the Radar is a production of the National Weather Desk. Make sure you're following the show on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. New episodes published every Tuesday morning. If you know someone interested in cicadas, or somebody who's scared of cicadas and worried about the upcoming emergence, please share this episode with them. We'd also love you to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Let us know what you think of the show, and you can give me ideas for future episodes. Special thanks to Dr. Floyd Shockley for his expertise. I'm meteorologist Emily Gracie. Make it a great day.